Hi, everyone. We're going to get started as we have people come into the session from the waiting room. So while we do that, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping for you. My name is Amy Conacher, and I am the Executive Director of the Australian American Chamber of Commerce here in Texas. And I'm excited to have you all with us tonight. We're looking forward to the program that we have in store. A couple housekeeping things. You'll notice when you came on that your audio and video have been muted. We do ask that you please keep those muted throughout the duration of the session. That's so that it's a courtesy for our speakers and our other attendees. We will be having live Q&A though at the end. We'll be conducting that through the chat tool. So feel free to use that chat tool to type in any questions that you might have during the session. That won't bother the presentation. And then we will answer those questions at the end, and any that don't get answered, we'll make sure that we follow up in an email. So you don't have to worry if your question doesn't get answered during the time allocated. We will also finish promptly at 6:45 so that you can all get on with your evenings or with your days if you're joining us from Australia. So I just now would like to hand over to our Chamber President, Christina Stabe. Christina is also the Senior Client Engagement Lead for the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and is based here in Houston.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for that nice introduction. So on behalf of the Australian American Chamber of Commerce, Texas, and our Board of Directors, I want to take the opportunity to welcome everyone to this webinar. This is the first of a series of 3 webinars that it's going to be about Australia's energy resources. And so the Chamber has enjoyed working with this team over the years. And although we can't be in person as we usually are, we're very grateful for the opportunity to host them for this event virtually. As an Australian-US organization, we value our relationships with government, companies, and individual professionals that are looking to invest in Australia and Texas. And that's part of our mission to strengthen the relationship between our 2 great countries. So let me hand it over to Tom Bernecker. He is the Director, Energy Resources Advice and Promotion with the Minerals, Energy, and Groundwater Division of Geoscience Australia. Thanks, Tom.
Good afternoon, Houston. Today, I'm talking to you from lockdown Canberra. It's quite a different scenario here. But before I continue with my presentation, I'd like to thank Amy and Christina very much for providing Australia Energy Resources with the opportunity to give you an update on our energy resources project as part of a seminar series that will take us to mid-November even. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Bernecker. I'm the Director of the Energy Resources Advice and Promotion section here at Geoscience Australia, and I represent Australia Energy Resources today as the first talk presentation in the seminar series, talking about the various energy resources projects. Just to kick things off, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the previously held APIA conference. This is an annual get-together of the petroleum industry. And at the conference every year, the most important issues affecting the industry are being discussed and being presented on. Very clearly, the industry is undergoing a major transition, and overall, the consensus is that the industry appears to be prepared to take on the emerging challenges. Overall, there is an agreement that the way forward is to embrace low emission technologies, and one of the important topics really was hydrogen, carbon capture, carbon utilization, and storage projects. In the discussion, one of the panel discussions, several representatives from the Australian Conservation Foundation, from the Investment House, and from the Investor Group on Climate Change, they very strongly argued the industry must change very, very rapidly and is totally against expanding the exploration for and production of and development of our natural gas and our fossil fuel resources. Scott Tinker, who many of you know, he is the director of the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas. He sort of said, well, hang on a minute here. It's all good to pursue a low carbon economy. However, to achieve that, there is a very strong requirement to continue to use fossil fuels. So we also feel that Geoscience Australia and our state and territorial geological surveys are well positioned to engage with the industry and provide new regional scale data information in support of enabling Australia's energy transition. And coming back to the global energy mix and the forecast, so this is really what Professor Tinker is all about. So globally, on the left-hand side, you can see the primary energy demand towards 2050 very clearly indicates that the renewable component of the energy will quite drastically increase, that coal will decrease, but that oil and gas more or less will stay constant in the forecast period. On the right-hand side, you have a very similar outlook. This is the global power generation. And again, you can see that the renewable energies will play a very, very significant role, forecast to deliver over 70% of the energy generation by 2050. But still, you can also see that natural gas and especially natural gas will continue to play a major role, and coal, of course, will decrease quite significantly. So what is Australia's position here? We recently published the Australian Energy Commodity Resources document, which provides a synopsis, a summary of the distribution and the scale of energy commodity resources across Australia, highlighting that we have abundant, high-quality energy commodity resources that will last to several decades. I think it's well known that coal and coal seam gas resources in Eastern Australia are quite abundant, and that we have large reserves and resources on the natural gas on the North West Shelf. Also, quite significantly, uranium in South Australia is one of the largest mines and uranium producers in the world. So this publication will be updated annually and is accessible on our website. Just briefly, when we talk about oil resources, Australia is a net oil importer, and that is likely to stay like this for the forecasting period. We have some reserves, but overall it is very clear that all the existing fields are in rapid decline. When we look at conventional, unconventional gas resources, the picture is somewhat different. Since 2019, and it's also well known, Australia managed to become the global LNG exporter #1. We have large reserves here in natural gas on the North West Shelf, as you can see on the left side map there. And we have large reserves and resources on the eastern seaboard, represented by the coal basins, the coal seam gas. On the right side, the map on the right-hand side identifies the large untapped unconventional gas potential. So several basins, sedimentary basins, are known to host significant accumulations of unconventional gas. However, production has not commenced at this stage. Beetaloo subbasin is the first one in which the proof of concept and the first production testing was successfully completed by Origin Energy recently. You will hear much more about this when Dorothy Close from the Northern Territory talks to you at the next seminar in next month. So I don't want to take away her thunder. So despite the fact that Australia has abundant gas resources, there is an identified gas shortfall in southeastern Australia. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that even if all developed, committed, and anticipated gas resource projects come online, including the mooted LNG import from the North West Shelf, the shortfall is predicted to kick in on the eastern seaboard around 26-27. On the right-hand side, you can see a prediction by Cooper Energy, who operate fields in the Cooper Basin and also in Victoria. And they're predicting that the southern gas production is the demand in South Australia will outstrip the production, mainly driven by the rapidly declining gas supply in the Bass Strait basins, especially in the Gippsland Basin. So again, here is a need to explore for and develop additional resources to really encounter the predicted shortfall. So the government is actually quite serious about all this, and they have started to implement several initiatives. At the moment, everything really revolves around the post-COVID-19 response to stimulate the economy very clearly. And really the view is here we need to establish a secure and stable energy supply to enable the expansion of domestic manufacturing, thereby creating jobs. All this then, in the longer term, is meant to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy with the ultimate aim to establish a world-class hydrogen export industry in this country. To achieve all this, it's very clearly that natural gas is seen as the enabler to deliver that transition and establish those the projects in the future. Another government initiative is the Strategic Basins Plan. This is part of the gas-fired economic recovery. This plan focuses on gas supply for Eastern Australia, as well as job creation to expand infrastructure and the manufacturing capabilities. And the basins were selected according to resource availability and the proximity to existing infrastructure. So far, the first 3 or 5 basins have been announced. So it's the Beetaloo Sub-Basin, for which much of the work has already been completed. The next areas that have been announced are the northbound Galilee Basin in eastern Queensland and the Cooper and Elval Basin in western Queensland, straddling the border to South Australia. So through the government directive, it's Geoscience Australia that will take on the responsibility to support the Strategic Basins Plan by providing trusted environmental and geological information. That means we will carry out baseline assessments, and especially we will investigate the possible impediments to future resource development. This will involve assessment of groundwater, distributional currents and linkages of aquifers with the producing areas. So the remaining 2 basins of those 5 basins are still to be announced. So if you look here at the Elval Basin, so the idea here is we have a status assessment. So at the moment we know that the Elval Basin is confirmed as prospective. 1 gas field is in production, and that gas field was discovered as early as 1964. However, there are many untested conventional plays in the deeper section, including what is believed to be represented by Devonian age reefs and also by salt structures. So the plan of the future work will be to update the geological framework, to carry out a resource assessment, and when we talk about hydrogen, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, to evaluate the salt occurrences for possible hydrogen storage. Then I'd like to talk about the Exploring for the Future program. This is a large-scale program meant to attract investment into the exploration for and the development of Australia's mineral, groundwater and energy resources. At the moment, we are in the phase of extension, the first extension of a 4-year program, so we have another 4 years, and 4 of the 8 projects that are currently being undertaken are assessing energy commodity resources. One of which is the Australia's Resources Framework. This is a nationwide project. It's a continental scale, and it will acquire new data, and it will integrate a multitude of geoscientific disciplines. We have the Officer Musgrave project, which is targeting the untapped potential in an underexplored region in Central Australia, mainly represented by the large Officer Basin, spanning the area to South Australia and into Western Australia. And we have the Barkly-Isa-Georgetown project, which is value adding to previously carried out investigations in northeastern Queensland. And then we have the Australia's Future Energy Resources project, which is an evaluation of the prospectivity and energy resources potential of some underexplored regions in Australia. And I'd like to provide a few more details on this. So the Australia's Future Energy Resources project, or AFER, will target the following commodities. First of all, we want to investigate the additional potential of gas and oil by defining new petroleum systems in underexplored regions. We want to investigate the availability of hydrogen for the production of green hydrogen, for the utilization of renewable energy. We want to talk about petroleum systems that will enable blue hydrogen to be produced, involving carbon capture and storage. And we also want to investigate the additional potential for liquid hydrocarbons to be produced by utilizing carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. Where we want to do this, the initial target area, as outlined here on the map by this stippled rectangle, is the Central Basin region represented by the Eromanga, Simpson, West Cooper, Bernecker, and Warburton basins. So this project comes with 4 modules, and I just very briefly summarize the major focus on these areas. So module 1 will be a resource assessment, involve well failure analysis, flare fairway mapping, and then virtually it's a yet to find study. Module 2 revolves around hydrogen, so investigating the natural hydrogen occurrence in these areas, opportunity for hydrogen storage, and I will talk about this a little bit more. We'll also utilize the hydrogen economic fairways tool to predict suitability for future investment into this commodity. Module 3 is the CO2 enhanced oil recovery, targeting residual oil zones. So we want to evaluate depleted hydrocarbon fields, what can be produced still, investigate paleo oil columns that have been overlooked or are still present, and overall assess the CO2 storage potential in these areas. Module 4 is a basin inventory, and this is focused on the yellow band there in Eastern Australia, gap analysis of underexplored basins in the region, recommendation for future work, and also the evaluation of petroleum systems, especially with the view of identifying source rock characteristics. So let's then talk a little bit more about hydrogen. It is quite interesting to hear about, and this comes out of a recent publication that was presented at the APEC conference and actually was awarded with best paper at the APEC conference, talking about the hydrogen occurrence in Australia. So hydrogen-rich natural gases were identified as early as 1917 on the York Peninsula and Kangaroo Island. In Geoscience Australia's lab, routinely the natural gases are being evaluated, and around 1,000 natural gases from 470 wells indicated that there is some significant hydrogen potential. And you can see that on the map, especially the ones in the dark red are quite high concentrations of H2 in the subsurface. So we believe that the hydrogen represents actually a mix of inorganic sources, deep-seated sources, and the mixture that mixing with decomposed organic matter at high temperatures, at high maturities. So this really provides opportunities to discover natural hydrogen in areas that have not been previously targeted by petroleum exploration. When we talk about hydrogen, we also want to talk about storage of hydrogen, and here we need to understand the distribution and occurrence of salt. So natural occurring hydrogen can be trapped within or below evaporate accumulations because these really provide a perfect seal. That salt can then also act as buffer, preventing reservoir breaching during prolonged tectonic activity. And as we can see on the map, the evaporites are widely distributed across the Australian sedimentary basins. These are believed to provide excellent storage potential for hydrogen in salt caverns, and thereby they provide a good guide for the establishment of hydrogen production centers. Geoscience Australia has developed the Hydrogen Opportunities tool, which allows, via interactive templates and interfaces, to really identify the feasibility, the economic feasibility, depending on the parameters you like to put in. So in the first example here, we have an input we're using what we would call green hydrogen. So hydrogen produced from renewable energies, 50% wind, 50% solar, and a target price of $4 per kilogram hydrogen. And then you can have the model run, and you can then see this map. On this map, blue is economically not feasible, white is break even, and the red areas are those areas in which, at that price, hydrocarbon production is economically feasible at today's values. We have another example here when we look at what we would call blue hydrogen, hydrogen produced involving carbon capture and storage from natural gases. So here we have steam methane reformation and attached carbon capture and storage project. The target price here would be $3.10 per kilogram hydrogen. And you can see that the map is completely different. The suitability is very, very much controlled by access to ports, infrastructure, and transportation networks. So at the moment, this form of hydrogen production is cheaper, but it will change dramatically in the coming decades. So very briefly, I'd like to touch on what's happening in the offshore. In June this year, the government released 21 new areas for petroleum exploration, for which the work program bidding will close on the 3rd of March 2022. This year we had pretty much an even distribution between areas released along the Northwest Shelf and on the southern margin. On the Northwest Shelf, the areas include hydrocarbon fields at Prometheus Rubicon gas field, the Puffin oil field, and the Cornea gas and oil field. The release areas on the southern margin, especially the one in the Elval Basin, supported by brand new data acquisition, a regional deep seismic program over the deepwater Otway, a brand new data over a previously underexplored region. So all the information about this year's acreage release is available on our website at Geoscience Australia in the middle there, and all the open file petroleum data submitted by the industry can be accessed on the NOPIMS website. And finally, I'd like to conclude with a new government initiative, and that revolves around making offshore acreage available for greenhouse gas storage. Nominations were received, and the areas that were identified as suitable have been now submitted for public consultation. This provides an opportunity to obtain acreage to explore 4 offshore greenhouse gas injection and storage locations. So this support initiatives to accelerate carbon storage by applying new technologies. And the first set of offshore greenhouse gas acreage, the government is on track to release these before the end of the calendar year. So just a very, very quick overview where these areas are. As I said, these are submitted for public consultation. So we have 2 areas here in the Petrel Subbasin. The storage will occur in saline aquifers, and the CO2 sources are derived from the Darwin processing facilities and possibly from future gas field development in the Bernecker Basin. The second area here is in the Browse Basin, again a storage in saline aquifers, and the CO2 sources here will be derived from the gases from future field developments in the Browse region. And finally, we have an area here in the Northern Carnarvon Basin where storage will occur in depleted gas fields. So here the CO2 sources are the industrial emissions from the greater Dampier region. So with this, I'd like to summarize and really highlight again and make the point Australia's energy mix is changing very rapidly. So the Australian government's energy initiatives in the short to medium term are targeting, first of all, COVID-19 recovery, but very clearly accelerating Australia's journey towards a low-emission economy. Natural gas is the enabler for that economic recovery and the establishment of a future hydrogen industry, and with an expansion of the entire renewable energy grid. So assessing the resource potential of the newly required energy commodities, including CCS and storage of hydrogen, thereby we as geologists can support Australia's transition to a low carbon economy. So on the right hand side here is some extra information in the websites that provide you with additional information. The Australian Energy Commodity Resources publication is freely available. There's a lot of information on the EFDA. If you want to know what Geoscience Australia is all about, please go to the GA website. So with that, I thank you very much, and we are now able to turn in live for a question and answer session. And I may even have my colleague Andrew Feitz with me, who can answer all the detailed questions on hydrogen. So thank you very much, and we hope to talk to you very soon.
Hey, thanks, Tom, for that wonderful presentation, and great to see you live from Canberra, I'm assuming?
Yeah, still in lockdown.
Okay. Andrew, great to see you as well. So we've had a few questions. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay. We have had a few questions come in, so let me start with those, but let me also remind the audience to please type your questions in the chat box, and that way we'll be able to pick them up as we continue going forward. So yeah, so the first question is, there seems to be a current focus on gas development. You just mentioned, Tom, with gas being an enabler. Is there still support for oil exploration?
The answer to that is yes. The government is still very keen to address the large amount, the large volumes that Australia is required to import when it comes to liquids. So in this context, as previously in many recent years described, there's a brand new oil province has been discovered between the Browse and the Northern Carnarvon Basin on the North Shelf. That is the Elval Basin that revolves around the discovery of the Dorado oil field. And the main operator, Santos, is making moves to bring these liquid resources online in the next 2 to 3 years. Having said that, there are still new discoveries being made in onshore Australia also. However, the large scale, large fields that may still be untapped in frontiers, those areas under the current climate seem not to be high on the industry's priorities. We certainly have seen a drop-off in the interest in exploring in rank frontiers.
Interesting. Okay. The next question is, let's see. Okay, then some of the new onshore projects that you mentioned in your presentation, are those to be carried out in collaboration with the state and territory jurisdictions?
Oh yes, very clearly so. So anything that the federal government or through Geoscience Australia is carrying out with in targeting onshore projects is carried out with support and in collaboration with our state and territory colleagues. So especially, and you sort of saw some of the presentation, when we go to the northeastern Queensland, the Barkly region, when we go to Officer Musgrave, and also the AFA project very, very strongly relies on the cooperation with our state and territory colleagues, because they have a wealth of data, a wealth of knowledge, which is really important for us to integrate the entire information and data sets to achieve the best possible outcome in understanding the resource potential of those underexplored regions.
Okay, thank you. This one might be for Andrew. There's a question about the Emissions Reduction Fund. Has CCS now been included in this fund, and how can the Emissions Reduction Fund help to support CCS deployment?
Yeah, so the Emissions Reduction Fund has historically been around dealing with fugitive emissions from coal mines, landfill, some land clearing type activities. But there is a method being currently developed that will include carbon capture and storage under that. So that's a really great development. And my understanding at this stage, however, is it's not going to extend to EOR. So it's going to be limited to just straight CCS at this stage. That it is quite interesting, actually. Earlier in the week, I was watching just the national news, and there was, for the first time I've ever seen, there was a description of the spot price of carbon in Australia. So the Emissions Reduction Fund has historically been bubbling along at about $16 for a long, long time. But over the last year, that's now crept up to $26, and it's really on an upward trajectory. So yeah, I think it should become more inviting at that sort of level. Yeah.
Sure, more supportive of project deployment.
Yeah.
Here's a question from one of our members, Wakar. Is there any estimate of the resource potential and economics of hydrogen production from, quote, hydrogen reservoirs? Could this kind of hydrogen production compete with green or blue hydrogen economically? So I suppose comparing the naturally occurring hydrogen, exploring for that versus actually manufacturing it.
Yeah, well, that's the big question. And it's really unknown at this stage. At this stage, we're just, trying to work out the occurrences of these resources, where they are, how much is there. And then, it's a matter of, once we understand that, we can work out, how much can be extracted from these particular resources, what's the recovery like. And then I think there's a fairly standard process then for for converting those recoveries into prices. But I've heard some numbers that it could be quite competitive to the aim that we have in Australia of getting H2 under 2, so hydrogen price under $2 per kilogram. But look, yeah, it's still very early days. We need to understand the resource and what makes a hydrogen system, like what makes a petroleum system.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another question about hydrogen, and basically, how will the hydrogen exploration be regulated? I guess that'd be at a state level, or? Yeah,
that's state level. And in fact, some states you can, hydrogen is sort of included under sort of the petroleum regulations, but some states don't have it. So yeah, they're all playing catch up at this stage about, places where you can do hydrogen exploration. I know that in South Australia, for example, and I think we've got Eleanor on the line, there's been a huge amount of uptake of tenement areas for hydrogen exploration.
Oh, Eleanor, since you're here, would you like to, as you have your hand raised, would you like to chime in on that question?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, I'm in the car at Ardrossan at the moment, but yeah, we've got about 20 applications for under our Petroleum Act for hydrogen exploration in South Australia. We had a change to our legislation earlier in the year that enabled it to be called a regulated substance. So I think we're a bit of a front runner in that space. So we're also enabling the transmission of hydrogen through pipelines, and there's more regulatory amendments to facilitate hydrogen. So the green and blue hydrogen facilities and so on are going to be regulated under our established petroleum legislation. So, but we have had a bit of a rush, and in fact, where I am on York Peninsula at the moment, it's currently under a petroleum license with the company looking for hydrogen. So yeah, thanks.
No, thank you, Eleanor, for filling in there. Absolutely. Okay, well, just keeping with the hydrogen theme, we've got one more hydrogen question here, and maybe this will be directed at you, Andrew, as well. Can you share why Australia is pursuing both green and blue hydrogen projects in their hydrogen strategy?
Yeah, so that was one of the big issues about, getting the hydrogen strategy and the acceptance from, the state, the federal, and all those different governments to agree. But look, I think it's quite a good strategy, actually. So blue hydrogen is CCS hydrogen, green hydrogen is with renewable energy. At the moment, it's cheaper. Our modeling suggests it's cheaper to produce hydrogen using with CCS, even taking into account the transportation and storage costs of carbon capture and storage. What's interesting, though, is looking further into the future, and that is all around if the cost of electrolyzers come down for renewable hydrogen from, they're quite high at the moment, but the price does seem to be dropping quite rapidly, and the cost of solar comes down even more in the future, then it looks like renewable hydrogen will be cheaper in about maybe a decade's time. So there's, but there are issues on both sides, right? So you may be aware if there's a very large project that's been announced, it's been the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. So that is an absolutely massive hydrogen project that was planned up in northwestern Australia. Now, it's huge. It's like 100 kilometers by 80 kilometers of, solar cells and wind farms. And, that's a big footprint. And so there were some questions about some of the environmental issues of that. So that the project has gone back and having to revise the planning around such a massive project. So I think you know, when you're talking about really large scale hydrogen projects, one of the advantages of the CCS hydrogen projects is their footprints are small. Whereas maybe with the green hydrogen projects, their footprints are very large. And so then there's a question around social acceptance of those very, very large projects. But look, it all comes down to price in the end. So, you know, if green hydrogen is much cheaper in, you know, 1-2 decades time, then they'll probably be the primary mechanism for hydrogen generation, I would say.
No, thank you, Andrew, for that very complete answer. So, Tom, I think this one will probably go back to you. You know, you presented so many different things and different opportunities for investment. And can you just comment, you know, what are there barriers to resource development in Australia right now?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, there is, and this is not a secret, there is a public resistance for any new fossil fuel development to be realized. But as the reality really kicks in, the requirement for the natural gas in support of enabling this energy mix in the path, I think there's very little other opportunities to pursue that path to follow the energy change. When it really comes to basin scale information with the geology, one of the most important impediments when it comes to areas like the northbound Galilee, which was announced as one of the priorities, or the Elval Basin as the other priority, we have to investigate, and this is part of the program, how does the availability of the resource and the production thereof potentially interfere with existing groundwater in existing aquifers. So we need to come to an understanding how to carefully produce these resources. Some of these areas are covered by some premier agricultural land. And again, so it has to be really understood that if there is a proposal to develop gas resources from deeper seated sources, normally I think we're looking at 2 to 3 kilometers, that any production is carried out very safely and does not interfere with existing groundwater that is used for agricultural purposes. So that's one of the areas too. The other impediments, and this I think applies to a lot of Australian inboard regions, is the lack of infrastructure. So if you want to develop resources at a reasonable and bring it to market at a reasonable price, you are reliant on expanding the infrastructure. And this then again will also create opportunities to invest into the expansion of infrastructure and also create jobs and apply new technologies. So there's I think Australia is really on the verge of changing its dependencies on a lot of importing technology, importing materials, if they are enabling a cleaner energy network that then enables local manufacturing. So this, I think, is really the main drive of the government's initiatives.
No, thanks for sharing that, Tom. And yeah, definitely at an inflection point with your energy mix changing so rapidly and opportunities for major infrastructure investments to support that. Another member, Colin McCaddy's asked, can we hear something about offshore wind initiatives, or is that in another session coming up later?
Well, offshore, I do believe mainly falls into the Commonwealth jurisdiction, so it's a federal thing. What is happening at the moment is in the offshore Gippsland region, offshore Gippsland, I think just outside or within the 3 mile zone. I have to double check my facts here a little bit, Colin. They will establish, or they have the approval to create a large offshore wind farm with, I do believe it's going to be feasible, or it's going to be up and running, or that's the plan. Nothing has been established yet. The plan is to have this delivering energy around 2030, 2032. So offshore wind is being talked about. and you'll probably hear more about this in the coming years.
Okay, no, that's a good answer, Tom. Thank you. Putting you on the spot there a little bit. Here's another question that might put you on the spot a little, but it's from one of our members, basically reporting that the Australian Financial Review today talked about the IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol saying Australia is in the position to become a global leader on clean energy, but the country needs to start applying its skills to help the world reach net zero. And in particular, CCS looks like it holds great potential for the clean energy sector in Australia. Do you guys want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, Tom, you want to do this?
I just do something and then I hand over to you.
Yeah.
It is very, very true that Australia is one of the leaders in carbon capture and storage, and people may be aware that the Gorgon project has been up and running now for the last 3 or 4 years. Still some technical issues, but overall, Australia is, as far as research into the storage opportunity is concerned, pretty much on the forefront. Mm-hmm. And I hand over to Andrew because he has a lot of knowledge about the research aspect and the monitoring and the real understanding on what happens to CO2 in the subsurface.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Look, I think it's worth just mentioning that, Australia was really going gangbusters with CCS about 10 years ago. Then there was a period where, CCS was not really supported by governments. But now in the last 2 years, especially with the release of the National Hydrogen Strategy, that was an absolute catalyst for CCS in Australia. So the Australian government has recently announced another $500 million program that will be opening, I think, in about a week. So if you're looking to invest in CCS projects in Australia, that will be open, I think, very shortly. But look, I think there is, I guess, a real recognition about the changing, I guess, the longer term use of carbon capture and storage as a negative emissions technology. And I think that's been reflected in the recent announcement of the CCS demonstration projects that were recently funded in Australia. So you have a DAX project, you have a capturing CO2 from a biogas plant and turning it into, CCU projects, so turning it into products. There was a few projects like this, which in the past have been sort of floating around the CCS type of research field, but they're starting now to get more mainstream support from the government. So I think, ultimately, when we're talking, decades into the future, that's where the real benefit, the real use of CCS is going to be. In the meantime, hydrogen is a way, or blue hydrogen is a way to help sort of kickstart that industry of producing these type of high-end products to support that. Yeah.
No, thanks. Thank you, Paul. Sorry, Andrew and Tom, for that commentary. Paul is the one who asked the question. Before we close, we've got one more question that I want to get to because I think it's very interesting about this greenhouse gas acreage. So someone had asked, is the bidding process to obtain offshore greenhouse gas acreage the same as for hydrocarbon exploration acreage?
Yes, the idea is it is very similar. So the government will release these areas. No firm date yet, but the target date will be end of November, early December. Then the areas are released and will be open for work bidding programs. They'll probably have a bidding period of 6 to 7 months. And then the same applies, it's competitive bidding, and the company with the most suitable assessed work program will get the license, will be awarded, will be offered the license.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for that answer. So I think that's pretty much the end of our questions, and we're getting close to the end of our time. So let me go ahead and wrap up. And first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to the collective Australia Energy Resources team for giving the Chamber the opportunity to host this. And as I said at the start, this is just the first of 3 webinars. So the 2 subsequent webinars are going to focus in more closely with the leads from the individual states and territories in Australia, giving the same kind of overview on oil and gas, energy transition, et cetera, projects that are coming up. So please do tune in for those as well. And thank you very much, Tom. And thank you, Andrew, for joining us. Here's a slide with the contact details for these guys. So feel free to reach out to them directly with any questions that you have. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Our pleasure. Thanks.